The Red Sea is no longer a passage. It is a battlefield. For decades, this narrow corridor was treated as a given, an invisible conveyor belt carrying energy, food, manufactured goods, and strategic stability between continents. Today, that assumption has collapsed. What was once a predictable artery of global commerce has become an active zone of coercion, where missiles, drones, and political signaling now dictate the rhythm of international trade. Since late 2023, a sharp surge in attacks on commercial shipping has shattered the illusion of maritime security. These are not isolated incidents. They are not random acts of violence or opportunistic harassment. They are calculated disruptions, executed with precision, timing, and strategic intent. The Houthis have demonstrated that you do not need to sink fleets to paralyze a system. You only need to inject uncertainty into it. A single drone launch, a single missile warning, a single near miss is enough to force insurers, ship owners, and governments to reassess risk. And once that reassessment begins, the system starts to seize. This is why framing the Red Sea crisis as a regional conflict is dangerously misleading. What is unfolding here is not confined to Yemen or the Arabian Peninsula or even the Middle East. The Red Sea represents a systemic vulnerability in the global economic order. Roughly 12% of global trade flows through these waters. Energy shipments from the Gulf, manufactured goods from Asia, food supplies bound for Europe and Africa all converge through a narrow maritime funnel that offers no redundancy when confidence breaks down. At the heart of this vulnerability lies the Bab el-Mandab Strait, a stretch of water barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. It is one of the most critical choke points on the planet, linking the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal. Asia, Europe, and global energy markets intersect here. When traffic through Bab el-Mandab slows, the ripple effects are immediate and global. Ships do not simply pause, they divert, they reroute thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery schedules and millions of dollars to operating costs. Those costs are already cascading through the system. Insurance premiums for Red Sea transits have spiked. Freight rates are climbing. Shipping timelines are stretching. The just-in-time logistics model, already weakened by pandemics and geopolitical shocks, is absorbing yet another blow. For consumers, this translates into higher prices. For import-dependent nations, it means renewed inflationary pressure. For fragile economies, it threatens outright instability. And yet, despite the visible economic damage, the most significant failure has been strategic. Military responses have not restored order. Naval patrols have not restored confidence. Multinational task forces have not reestablished deterrence. This is not because of a lack of firepower, but because firepower alone no longer guarantees control. The assumption that naval dominance automatically secures sea lanes belongs to another era, one where threats were symmetrical, state-based, and predictable. The core issue here is not piracy. It is not even missiles. It is power. Who can shape behavior? Who can impose costs? And who can force adaptation? Deterrence in the Red Sea has failed, not because defenses are absent, but because the system they are meant to protect is too exposed, too concentrated, and too essential to absorb sustained pressure. The Houthis understand this. So do their sponsors, and increasingly so do global markets. What we are witnessing is the early stage of a broader realignment, where trade routes are no longer neutral infrastructure but contested strategic terrain. When confidence in maritime security erodes, alliances shift, doctrines change, and the global balance recalibrates. The Red Sea is no longer just a waterway, it is a warning. To understand why this narrow stretch of water now holds the global economy hostage, we must go back before the drones, before the missiles, to the deeper history that made this crisis inevitable. To understand why the Red Sea is once again at the center of global disruption, we must strip away the illusion that this instability is new. In reality, the Red Sea has always been contested space. Long before container ships, oil tankers, and global insurance markets, this narrow corridor served as one of humanity's earliest commercial highways. Ancient Egyptian expeditions, Roman grain convoys, and later Islamic caliphates all depended on Red Sea routes to link Asia, Africa, and Europe. Trade did not merely pass through these waters, it shaped empires around them. As global commerce evolved, the logic remained the same. Whoever controlled the Red Sea controlled movement. When European colonial powers arrived, they understood this instinctively. British sea power in the 19th century was built around securing choke points, not entire oceans. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 transformed the Red Sea from a regional artery into a global superhighway, compressing distance between East and West and hardwiring dependency into international trade. From that moment forward, the world's economies began stacking themselves atop a handful of narrow maritime passages. This dependency deepened during the Cold War. Maritime control doctrine assumed that dominant navies, particularly Western ones, would guarantee uninterrupted sea lanes. The Red Sea was absorbed into this mental map of security, patrolled indirectly through alliances, bases, and assumed deterrence. Yet this confidence masked a structural weakness. The system relied not on absolute control, but on the absence of serious challenge. When that absence disappeared, so did the illusion of safety. Nowhere is this clearer than in the case of Yemen. Sitting astride the southern gateway to the Red Sea, Yemen has always occupied strategic real estate without possessing strategic stability. Decades of internal fragmentation, tribal politics, foreign intervention, and economic collapse ensured that Yemen would remain a pressure point rather than a pillar of order. Policymakers treated this instability as a humanitarian concern, not a systemic risk to global trade. That was a mistake. Out of this environment emerged the Houthis, not as a global threat at first, but as a localized insurgent movement rooted in northern Yemen. Over time, conflict hardened them, war professionalized them, external support transformed them. What began as a domestic rebellion evolved into a capable regional actor with access to missiles, drones, and targeting intelligence. The Houthis did not merely gain weapons, they gained strategic relevance. This evolution cannot be separated from Iranian doctrine. Tehran has long understood that it cannot match Western naval power ship for ship. Instead, it applies pressure asymmetrically, exploiting geography and choke points. Maritime disruption offers leverage without direct confrontation. By empowering partners near critical waterways, Iran extends influence while maintaining deniability. The Red Sea, like the Strait of Hormuz, fits perfectly into this playbook. Western planners, however, remained anchored to outdated assumptions. They believed that freedom of navigation was a permanent condition, enforced automatically by superior fleets. They underestimated how vulnerable concentrated trade routes become when faced with persistent low-cost disruption. The Bab el-Mandab Strait was never truly secure, it was merely uncontested. That distinction matters because once contestation begins, control evaporates quickly. The continuity from Cold War maritime doctrine to today is striking. Then, as now, planners assumed that visible strength equaled deterrence. But deterrence depends on credibility, not presence alone. When adversaries discover that disrupting trade imposes more cost than defending it, the balance shifts. History explains why the Red Sea is vulnerable, but it does not explain the shock. That comes from what actually began happening in the water after late 2023. The escalation did not begin with a single dramatic strike. It unfolded methodically, almost quietly, in late 2023, as commercial vessels transiting the southern Red Sea began reporting near misses, drone sightings, and missile alerts. At first, these incidents were treated as isolated provocations. Then patterns emerged: container ships, oil tankers, and bulk carriers, civilian vessels with no military value, were increasingly targeted not for destruction, but for disruption. The message was unmistakable. The flow of commerce itself had become the battlefield. The Houthis expanded their operational tempo with striking speed, using a mix of one-way attack drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles adapted for maritime use. They demonstrated an ability to threaten vessels far beyond Yemen's immediate coastline. These were not blind launches. Targeting intelligence derived from commercial tracking data, open-source shipping information, and external support allowed attacks to be timed for maximum psychological and economic impact. Ships were engaged at choke points during high-traffic windows, and often in ways designed to force evasive maneuvers rather than catastrophic damage. What made this campaign strategically effective was that success did not depend on sinking ships. A failed missile strike still triggered alarms. A drone intercepted by air defenses still forced a vessel to alter course. Each incident injected uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. In maritime commerce, fear is force. Insurance markets respond instantly to risk perception, not battlefield outcomes. Once underwriters began reclassifying the Red Sea as a high-risk zone, the strategic effect multiplied far beyond the physical damage inflicted. Shipping companies reacted rationally and decisively. Major carriers announced temporary suspensions of Red Sea transits. Others rerouted entire fleets thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery schedules and dramatically increasing fuel costs. Some firms withdrew altogether, unwilling to expose crews and assets to an environment where escalation appeared unbounded. These decisions were not coordinated by governments. They were driven by markets, and markets, unlike militaries, do not wait for political reassurance. Naval escorts were deployed, but their presence failed to restore confidence. Warships can defend a limited number of vessels at a time across vast expanses of water against threats that cost a fraction of traditional defensive systems. The problem was not courage or capability, it was scale. A single drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can force evasive action from a vessel worth hundreds of millions. An anti-ship missile, even when intercepted, compels caution across an entire shipping lane. This asymmetry is decisive. It favors the attacker not through firepower but through economics. The limitations of naval deterrence were further exposed by the nature of the threat. The Houthis are not a conventional navy. They do not present fleets to be destroyed or bases easily neutralized without escalation. Their launch platforms are mobile, concealed, and embedded within civilian terrain. Strikes against them risk regional expansion, while restraint invites continued disruption. This strategic dilemma paralyzed decisive action and reinforced the perception that the route was fundamentally unsafe. In this environment, commerce, not navies, became the primary target. The objective was never to defeat Western fleets outright, but to make protection so costly, so uncertain, that the global trading system would reroute itself. In that sense, the campaign succeeded. The Houthis demonstrated that controlling a choke point does not require occupying it. It only requires the ability to contest it persistently. The Red Sea crisis revealed a hard truth. Modern economies are more vulnerable to disruption than militaries are to attack. When trade falters, alliances strain, inflation rises, and political pressure builds far from the point of impact. If the attacks themselves were alarming, the real shock came from how the world responded or failed to. The failure of deterrence in the Red Sea did not occur because the West lacked military power. It failed because power was applied through a doctrine that no longer matches reality. Operation Prosperity Guardian was conceived as a reassurance mission, a visible demonstration that Western navies could still guarantee freedom of navigation. Warships were deployed, patrols intensified, and statements issued. Yet confidence did not return, markets did not stabilize, shipping companies did not resume normal transits. In strategic terms, that is the only metric that matters, and it revealed failure almost immediately. At the core of this failure lies a mismatch between Cold War naval doctrine and modern asymmetric warfare. Western maritime strategy was built around fleet-on-fleet confrontation, sea control through dominance, and deterrence through overwhelming response. That model assumes a rational adversary with assets to lose, ports, fleets, command centers. The Houthis present none of these targets in a form that guarantees decisive results. They operate dispersed, mobile, and embedded within civilian geography. The cost curve favors them. The risk curve punishes those who defend. Western escalation restraint compounded this imbalance. Political leaders sought to contain the crisis, fearing regional spillover, wider war, or direct confrontation with Iran. The result was a fragmented command environment, where multiple navies operated under overlapping but constrained rules of engagement. Each ship could defend itself. Few could impose consequences beyond the moment of attack. Deterrence, however, depends on altering enemy behavior, not intercepting individual threats in isolation. This produced what can only be described as the illusion of escalation control. Airstrikes were launched against launch sites and storage facilities, signaling resolve while carefully avoiding escalation thresholds. Yet airstrikes do not equal sea control. Destroying a warehouse does not reassure an insurer. Striking a radar site does not convince a shipping company to risk a billion-dollar asset and a multinational crew. Control of the sea is not achieved through punishment alone. It requires predictability, permanence, and the credible denial of future disruption. None of those conditions were met. The strategic cost of this signaling was immense. By demonstrating that trade protection would be cautious, conditional, and politically constrained, Western powers unintentionally communicated weakness, not military weakness, but economic vulnerability. Adversaries learned that disrupting commerce imposes more pressure on Western systems than defending it does on them. This inversion is critical. It marks a shift in how deterrence functions in the modern world. In previous eras, deterrence rested on the threat of force escalation. Today, it increasingly rests on economic credibility, the belief that trade routes will remain open regardless of pressure. Once that belief erodes, deterrence collapses rapidly. Markets adapt faster than militaries. Insurance premiums rise overnight. Rerouting decisions are made in boardrooms, not war rooms. Naval presence becomes symbolic if it cannot reverse those decisions. What unfolded in the Red Sea is therefore not a tactical failure, but a strategic revelation. Western navies remain formidable, but the systems they are tasked to protect have become exquisitely fragile. Concentrated trade routes, just-in-time logistics, and globally synchronized supply chains leave no margin for sustained disruption. The Houthis did not need to defeat a fleet. They only needed to expose this fragility and apply steady pressure. This is why the Red Sea crisis matters far beyond its geography. It demonstrates that deterrence has shifted from dominance to resilience, from firepower to confidence. When confidence collapses, protection becomes irrelevant. And when deterrence fails, systems adapt, not slowly, but brutally. When deterrence fractures, the future does not arrive as a single outcome, it branches. The Red Sea crisis now sits at precisely that point where multiple trajectories are plausible, none of them stable, and all of them carrying strategic cost. The danger is not simply escalation, but miscalculation, because in an environment of persistent pressure, even rational actors begin reacting to shadows. The first and most likely scenario is prolonged, low-intensity disruption becoming normalized. In this future, attacks continue sporadically, missiles are intercepted, drones are shot down, no decisive blow is struck, and no decisive response follows. Instead, disruption becomes background noise. Shipping adapts partially, insurers price in permanent risk, and navies remain deployed indefinitely. This is the most corrosive outcome because it quietly redefines what normal looks like. Trade continues, but at higher cost and lower efficiency. The global system does not break, it bleeds. Over time, that bleeding translates into slower growth, chronic inflationary pressure, and widening inequality between states that can absorb disruption and those that cannot. The second scenario is regional escalation, pulling in state actors who have so far remained at the margins. Iran's strategic calculus is central here. Tehran benefits from pressure that weakens Western credibility without triggering direct confrontation, but escalation is not always deliberate. A misattributed strike, a high-casualty incident, or an attack on a vessel linked to a major ally could rapidly widen the conflict. Israel's involvement would immediately raise stakes, as would direct participation by Gulf states whose energy exports are directly threatened. Once state militaries engage openly, the Red Sea transforms from contested commerce space into a conventional theater with unpredictable spillover effects. In that environment, alliance entanglements become dangerous accelerants. NATO members, regional partners, and security guarantors are drawn in not because they seek war, but because credibility demands response. Nuclear escalation remains unlikely but not irrelevant. It lurks indirectly in the background, not as an immediate option, but as a constraint shaping decision-making among nuclear-armed allies and adversaries. The more actors involved, the harder escalation control becomes, and the greater the risk that a localized clash triggers a disproportionate response elsewhere. The third scenario is the most economically disruptive, strategic withdrawal from Red Sea routes altogether. If confidence cannot be restored, markets will eventually choose certainty over efficiency. Rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope becomes permanent rather than temporary. This fundamentally alters global logistics. Transit times lengthen, fuel consumption rises, shipping capacity tightens, Energy markets feel the strain first. Oil and liquefied natural gas deliveries slow, price volatility increases, and inflationary feedback loops ripple outward from Europe to Asia to the developing world. Energy shocks do not remain contained. Higher transportation costs raise food prices, manufacturing slows, central banks face renewed pressure as inflation resurges without corresponding growth. For import-dependent nations, particularly in Africa and South Asia, the consequences could be severe. Strategic withdrawal would not just reshape trade, it would rewire economic hierarchies. Across all scenarios, unpredictability is the dominant risk. Not knowing when the next attack might occur, which vessel will be targeted, or how markets will react, creates a constant state of tension. Systems under tension do not behave linearly. Small events produce outsized reactions. Political pressure mounts domestically as prices rise and supply chains falter. Leaders respond not with long-term strategy, but with short-term crisis management. This is why the Red Sea crisis cannot be measured solely in military terms. The missiles matter, the ships matter, but the deeper impact lies in how states, markets, and alliances adapt to sustained uncertainty. Power is shifting toward those who can endure disruption, absorb cost, and force others to adapt first. But the most profound consequences are not military, they are geopolitical. Strategic disruption becomes real only when it touches daily life. The Red Sea crisis crossed that threshold the moment ships began rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope. What looks like a line on a map is, in reality, a fundamental alteration of global logistics. The detour adds thousands of nautical miles to each voyage, weeks to delivery schedules, and enormous fuel costs to every shipment. Those costs do not vanish into spreadsheets. They surface in prices paid by consumers, governments, and the most vulnerable populations first. For Europe, the impact is immediate and structural. The continent relies heavily on maritime imports for energy, industrial components, and foodstuffs. Longer transit times mean tighter inventories and renewed exposure to supply shocks. Energy markets feel the pressure early, as oil and liquefied natural gas shipments face delays and higher transport costs. These pressures compound existing inflation challenges, forcing policymakers into difficult trade-offs between economic stability and political credibility. Strategic decisions made far from European households now influence heating bills, grocery prices, and industrial competitiveness. In Asia, the effects are equally profound but differently distributed. Export-driven economies face bottlenecks as finished goods arrive late or shipping capacity tightens. Manufacturing schedules slip. Warehouses fill with unsent products. For countries that depend on imported energy and raw materials, price volatility becomes a persistent threat. The Red Sea disruption exposes how tightly Asian growth is coupled to uninterrupted maritime flow and how fragile that coupling becomes under sustained pressure. The consequences are most severe in developing economies where margins for error are thin. Many African and Middle Eastern states depend on affordable maritime transport for food, medicine, and fuel. When shipping costs rise, these essentials become scarcer and more expensive. Aid shipments slow, medical supplies face delays, food insecurity deepens. These are not abstract outcomes. They translate into human suffering that is both immediate and politically destabilizing. Governments facing rising prices and shortages confront unrest, while lacking the fiscal capacity to cushion the blow. Supply chain delays amplify these effects across sectors. Pharmaceuticals arrive late. Agricultural inputs miss planting windows. Energy shortages ripple into transportation and power generation. The just-in-time system, optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, offers little buffer. What was once a strength becomes a liability under sustained disruption. Each delay compounds the next, creating feedback loops that are difficult to arrest. This suffering is not accidental. It is the downstream consequence of strategic choices of where navies deploy, how deterrence is signaled, and which risks are tolerated. Civilian hardship is the invisible terrain of modern conflict. It is where pressure accumulates until political systems bend. The Red Sea crisis demonstrates that targeting commerce indirectly targets societies without ever engaging their militaries directly. Yet amid this pressure, an important pattern emerges. States adapt faster than alliances. Individual governments begin recalibrating trade routes, stockpiling reserves, subsidizing key imports, or seeking bilateral security arrangements. Corporations diversify suppliers, shift manufacturing footprints, and renegotiate logistics contracts. These adaptations happen quickly, driven by necessity. Alliances, by contrast, move slowly. Consensus takes time. Command structures lag behind market realities. The gap between state-level adaptation and alliance-level response widens. This divergence matters. As states adjust independently, shared frameworks weaken. Long-standing assumptions about collective protection of trade routes give way to pragmatic, sometimes transactional arrangements. Economic survival begins to outweigh ideological alignment. The pressure of disruption accelerates this shift, nudging the world toward a more fragmented, interest-driven order. The Red Sea crisis thus reveals a deeper truth. Global stability rests not only on military balance, but on the uninterrupted flow of goods that sustain everyday life. When that flow is disrupted, the effects radiate outward from boardrooms to kitchens, from strategy rooms to hospital wards. And that adaptation, already underway, is reshaping the global order. The Red Sea crisis is not a temporary disruption, and it is not a localized anomaly. It is a strategic signal. When we pull together the threads from the historical vulnerability of maritime choke points to the modern weaponization of commerce, from the failure of deterrence to the human cost of disruption, a clear lesson emerges. Control of trade is no longer a supporting function of power. It is power, and those who can contest it even indirectly can reshape global behavior far beyond their immediate reach. What unfolded in the Red Sea exposed a fundamental shift. Superior firepower did not restore confidence. Naval presence did not guarantee security. Carefully calibrated strikes did not deter continued disruption. Instead, markets made the decisive call. Insurers raised rates. Shipping companies rerouted fleets. Governments scrambled to mitigate domestic fallout. In strategic terms, this was not a military defeat, but it was a systemic one. It showed that the credibility of protection matters more than the promise of response. The deeper warning is this: alliances are no longer being tested primarily on battlefields. They are being tested in logistics networks, insurance markets, and supply chains. Ideology, shared values, and political declarations matter, but they bend under sustained economic pressure. When trade routes become unreliable, states prioritize survival and stability over alignment. Cooperation becomes conditional. Commitments become negotiable. The Red Sea has revealed how quickly logistics can rewrite relationships that once seemed permanent. This is the essence of the Macgregor-style warning. Modern power is exercised not just through force, but through the ability to guarantee movement of energy, food, medicine, and industrial inputs. When that guarantee fails, the consequences cascade. Inflation rises, political pressure mounts, strategic patience erodes. Adversaries do not need to defeat armies if they can exhaust systems. And systems built for efficiency rather than resilience exhaust quickly. The question that now confronts policymakers and all of us is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Is the world prepared for permanent trade insecurity? Not a crisis that ends with a ceasefire, but a condition that persists. A world where choke points remain contested, rerouting becomes routine, and economic friction is normalized. If the answer is no, then adaptation must accelerate through diversification of routes, redundancy in supply chains, and a sober reassessment of what deterrence actually requires in the 21st century. This is where your voice matters. The future of global trade will not be shaped by one government or one alliance alone. It will be shaped by how societies respond to cost, risk, and uncertainty. Do we invest in resilience even at higher upfront expense? Do we accept longer routes and higher prices as the new normal? Or do we continue assuming that the old guarantees will somehow reassert themselves? I invite you to weigh in. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which trade routes will define the next decade? Will alternative corridors replace vulnerable choke points? Or will contested waters become the permanent front line of global competition? Debate this, challenge it, and bring your perspective, because these decisions will affect far more than abstract strategy. The Red Sea is not just a warning about maritime security. It is a reminder of how civilizations endure or fail. History shows us again and again that strength is not measured only by armies in the field, but by the arteries that sustain them. And the lesson could not be clearer. Empires fall not when armies lose battles, but when supply lines collapse.